Burn spells are shorthand for an effect that deals damage to a player, creature, or a planeswalker. These are a big part of Red's color pie, and the best ones tend to see a lot of play. There's a bit of debate about exactly what qualifies, but for this list, it needed to be an instant or sorcery that can deal damage to a player specifically. Anyway, today we're going to go over some of the worst burn spells in all of Magic. And at number 10, we have Meteor Shower. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of XX, meaning any amount of mana twice, and 1 red. It deals X plus 1 damage divided as you choose amongst any number of targets. This card suffers from the curse of how quickly a double X cost scales. X spells suffer a lot from not ever being really efficient cards, but this card really takes the cake. For a quick summary, you can deal 1 damage for 1 mana, 2 damage for 3 mana, 3 damage for 5 mana, and so on and so on. This rate is abysmal at every step of the curve. The main upside is being able to split up your damage amongst multiple targets. However, this really isn't worth it. If you want to get rid of an opponent's board of small creatures, cards like Pyroclasm or Forked Bolt do a much better job. Unlike most other X spells, this card doesn't get better at the high end of the curve. Usually, the idea with X spells is to hold them until late game and try to dump all of your mana into them. However, with Meteor Shower, even if you pour 9 mana into it, the effect on the game is minimal, only dealing 5 damage. This will rarely be enough to burn your opponent to death, and its ability to work as a removal spell is far worse than more standard burn spells. This is probably one of the worst X cost burn spells in Magic, and one of the worst burn spells overall, but it does actually get worse from here. And at number 9, we have Hanabi Blast. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 and 2 red. It has the effect where Blast deals 2 damage to any target, then you return it to your hand and discard a card at random. This is an interesting card, as it has a unique effect that feels like it could almost be really good. However, the combination of this drawback of needing to discard a random card on top of the bad rate for the effect kills basically any niche the card could have. The issue is how Blast sort of takes over your deck if you try to play it. The thing is, discarding a card at random every turn makes it basically impossible to play a game of Magic. You can't really make any plans, because every card in your hand could simply vanish next turn. If you don't build around Blast, you'll likely never cast it, as it'd be too risky to discard an important card on accident. However, the card isn't good enough to build around. The upside is supposed to be that you can use the card over and over again, but if casting a spell is bad the first time, you're not likely to want to keep trying. Hanabi Blast just does everything wrong. It's too expensive and makes your entire deck need to be about it, which only very, very strong cards can get away with. And at number 8, we have Boulderfall. This is an instant with a mana cost of 6 and 2 red. It has the effect to deal 5 damage divided as you choose amongst any number of targets. Boulderfall is just far too expensive for its effect. Dealing damage divided amongst multiple targets is a strong ability. There is a point where the effect just gets too expensive to be worth it though. 8 mana is so much that you basically need to be winning the game. Boulderfall will usually be a dead card in your hand. Most games don't even get to the point where you could even cast Boulderfall, and if you're trying to ramp up for a big spell, there are just so many better cards you could be casting. I think the card that really shows the issue with this card is Rolling Thunder. This is a sorcery that costs X and 2 red, and deals X damage divided however you choose amongst any number of targets. Thunder can do the same amount of damage as Boulderfall for 1 less mana, with the only downside being that it's sorcery. The thing is, the main drawback of X spells is supposed to be how inefficient they are. They're supposed to be outperformed by other spells at every mana value, with the upside being their versatility. The fact that Thunder outperforms Boulderfall for less mana just really shows how overcosted and unplayable the card is. And at number 7, we have Parallectric Feedback. This is an instant with a mana cost of 3 and 1 red. It has the effect where feedback deals damage equal to the mana value of target spell to that spell's controller. This is a very inconsistent card to get to work. The average mana value of a spell only goes down the more powerful a format is, and even in the weakest formats like Standard, the average mana value of the card is around 3. This makes it worse than a card like Lightning Strike. Now, it can do more damage than a card like Lightning Strike can, but that's not quite enough to make the card useful. In order for the card to really be worth it, you need to be dealing around 5 damage. That way, it can be used to close the game later on. However, this is really inconsistent. Most decks won't be playing that many expensive cards, if any, especially in older formats. That means you have to be sideboarding the card and just bring it in against things like ramp decks that play very expensive cards. However, this never really worked out. Beyond the fact that there were just way better options to be bringing in against aggro decks in these matchups, it's also pretty easy to play around it if you know your opponent has it. 4 mana is just far too much, and your opponent will easily be able to tell you're holding it up. They can easily just try and cast their less expensive spells whenever they have the mana up. Ultimately, this was just a clunky spell that was completely overshadowed by every other burn card. And at number 6, we have Liquid Fire. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 4 and 2 red. It has the effect where you choose a number from 0 to 5. It deals X damage to target creature and 5 minus X damage to its controller, where X is the number you choose. This card is pretty similar to Boulderfall. It deals the same amount of damage and it also costs less mana. So, shouldn't Liquid Fire be the better card? Well, the issue is that Boulderfall can actually deal damage to multiple creatures, letting you get a 2 or more for 1. Additionally, it can just deal 5 damage to your opponent without your opponent controlling any creatures, and it can hit planeswalkers. While costing 8 mana is a huge downside, there are some situations where it could actually put in a lot of work. Liquid Fire, on the other hand, is just terrible. It's pretty easily outperformed by cards like Hungry Flames, which does 5 damage divided amongst all creatures and players for half the mana at an instant speed. Actually, just about any red removal spell would be better than Liquid Fire. Even just a Lightning Strike will usually do a better job killing creatures or burning your opponent to death. And Strike is a burn spell that standard players kind of have to settle with running only when Wizards doesn't print any actual good burn spells. Basically, Liquid Fire is never really better than any other burn card in anything other than incredibly niche situations. And at number 5, we have Scorching Spear. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 red. It has the effect where it deals 1 damage to any target. This is a pretty pitifully weak effect. 1 damage is an effect that you can literally get for 0 mana, and that card is only good, not amazing or anything. This is such a small amount of damage that it can barely answer anything, and trying to use it to kill your opponent is laughable. So the main thing we should talk about is why this card isn't higher up on this list. The thing is, the card can do something in certain metas. Cards like End the Festivities see play for their ability to deal 1 damage to your opponent's entire board. There are good 1 toughness creatures all over, and Spear can answer them. Now, there's literally no upside to playing Spear over a card like Lightning Bolt, End the Festivities, or Lava Dart. If you're playing Scorching Spear, you're doing something wrong. However, unlike the cards higher up on this list, there are a few matchups where the card could at least do a reasonable impression of an actually good card, so it only finds itself halfway down the middle of the spot on this list. And at number 4, we have Kamahl's Sledge. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 5 and 2 red. It has the effect where it deals 4 damage to target creature, but if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, it deals 4 damage to a creature and 4 damage to that creature's controller. This is another extremely overpriced burn spell that just doesn't have any real home. If you don't get the threshold off, this card is laughably bad. Just for reference, Strangle deals 1 less damage to a creature for 1/7 of Kamahl's mana cost. So you have to be planning to fill your graveyard if you want to play this card. However, even if you do get to deal 4 damage to a creature and a player, it isn't worth it. Again, for 7 mana, you need a very strong effect to justify running a card. Compare this to a card like Unlicensed Disintegration, a 3 mana instant that just destroys a creature and deals 3 damage to a controller if you control an artifact. Not only is this card better at killing creatures, it also has an easier condition to fulfill. The only downside of the card is that it deals 1 less damage than Sledge does. It's hard to put into words just how much better Disintegration is than Sledge, but it shows in how much more play the card has seen. And at number 3, we have Ember Shot. This is an instant with a mana cost of 6 and 1 red. It is the effect where Ember Shot deals 3 damage to any target and you draw a card. Again, this card simply costs way too much. Sure, getting a burn spell that cycles itself is really strong. Cards like Electrolyze have seen play for this exact reason. Though if you compare the cards, it becomes obvious just how far behind Ember Shot is. Electrolyze only deals 1 less damage than Shot does and costs less than half as much mana. Rawl's Outburst costs only 4 mana, deals the same amount of damage, and actually lets you look at the top 2 cards of your deck and choose a card to draw, instead of just drawing a card. And this card isn't even insane or anything. It's a fair magic card. Ember Shot costs nearly twice as much mana and is worse in just about every way. There's no home for Ember Shot, which is why no one has ever run it in any deck that was actually trying to win. And at number 2, we have Flaming Gambit. This is a sorcery with the mana cost of X and 1 red. It has the effect where it deals X damage to target player or planeswalker, but that player may have it deal damage to one of the creatures instead. It also has flashback X and 2, meaning you can cast it from your graveyard for this cost, but you have to exile it afterwards. Gambit is what the Magic community calls a Punisher card, a card that gives your opponent one of 2 bad options to choose from. The most famous of these is Browbeat, a 3 mana sorcery that lets you either draw 3 cards or deal 5 damage to your opponent. This wasn't quite good enough to see play, but some versions of this card have found some success. I mention this because both of Browbeat's effects are way above the curve, and it'd be kind of broken if you got to choose which one to get. And that's how Punisher cards are supposed to work. They're supposed to be way above rate, but will always do the worst thing possible. Gambit, like most X cost burn spells, isn't even on rate at any point on the curve. It doesn't even deal an extra point of damage to make it better than cards like Fireball. It just gets to have flashback, which isn't anywhere near enough. Not to mention, this specific Punisher choice is very weighted. Your opponent gets to choose which creature it deals damage to instead of you. They can easily redirect it to a token, or a creature that's not too big for it to kill, or an indestructible or regenerating creature instead, so the card doesn't even work as removal. Everything about this card is terrible, but somehow there's a card that makes it look like a staple. And at number 1, we have Backdraft. This is an instant with the mana cost of 1 and 1 red. It has the effect where you choose a player who has cast a sorcery spell this turn, and then it deals damage equal to half the damage of one of the sorceries dealt, rounded down. So, where to begin? First off, this card will barely ever work. Not only are burn cards only a part of Red's color pie, but most of the ones people play are instants, not sorceries. I have no idea why it couldn't work for both instants and sorceries, but I'll just chalk it up to early Magic weirdness. Next, this card doesn't even deal a good amount of damage. You would expect a card that's this narrow to try and punish your opponent for overextending, sort of like Parallectric Feedback was trying to do. However, this card only deals half the damage of the sorcery they played. I'd expect it to deal twice as much damage, or maybe even redirect all the spell's damage to the controller so it can work as a sort of protection spell. But this card actually does less damage than this spell does, which makes me wonder why you aren't just casting the card instead of this trash. And just to kick you while you're down, the card rounds down the damage. There are cards that round up when doing this kind of math, such as Pox, so there's no rule against rounding up on Magic cards. Wizards just felt that the card needed to be even worse than it already was for whatever reason. Now, a lot of the cards in this list could, theoretically, do something in a game. They're not good, but if you wanted to make a meme deck, you could try and force them and win some commander games with some gimmicks. Backdraft, however, really does feel like there's no way to make this card good. It's a card you have to wait for a blue moon for a chance to actually use it that doesn't do anything when it's actually active. It's easily the worst burn card in Magic. Alright, and that's the list. Do you think there are any other worse burn cards we may have missed, or have ideas for future videos similar to this one? If so, please let us know down below.